So thanks for having me at CUSP at King's College to talk about my research. Um, as Daniele mentioned, Giovanni in the last talk spoke about Airbnb, and I'm going to look at it from the angle of kind of culture and culture in cities. So the title of my talk is called Data Science for Art and Culture. It's kind of a lecture series that I've been giving quite a bit, especially last year. A lot of things have changed since last year, and I will talk about kind of the effects of COVID-19 and a range of other things on cities and culture in particular. But what I want to do is I'll quickly just give an introduction about myself, and then I'll dive straight into some previous work that I've done, as well as the motivations for this current project. This project at the moment, the one I'm going to mainly talk about, is about this term called cultural infrastructure, which is being used by the GLA, the Greater London Authority, and the Mayor of London to describe all of London's cultural assets. And I'll look at the kind of relationship between cultural infrastructure and Airbnb. And then I will kind of talk a little bit about future research and how I see the project and the research developing in the future. So I'm several things, but I'm kind of branding myself as a cultural data scientist. So I work as an analyst and a consultant for a range of clients in the cultural sector, both in the public side of the sphere as well as the private side. And I also work with governments and kind of national authorities to help them with their cultural data science strategy and how they can use data science and visualization to understand and measure the impact of culture. I'm also a part-time postgraduate research student at the Bartlett Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, which is called CASA, and I'm studying spatial data science and visualization. My thesis looks at measuring the economic and social impact of art and culture in cities. I also have two businesses. So I'm the founder of a company called Photogram AI, which is a computational photography startup, which is not directly relevant to this talk. But my second company, Culture in Cities, definitely is. It's a cultural data science consultancy, and I mainly use my academic research and I kind of turn it into my consultancy essentially to advise governments and institutions. So I started out life studying applied economics at LSE in London, and then my interest in cities really stemmed from my kind of undergrad at LSE. But since then, I've worked at I did a master's, in art business, and I worked at Sotheby's auction house. So I had about 3 to 4 years experience in the art world, mainly looking at flat art, but the importance of art within museums and cultural buildings was also really interesting to me. As I mentioned, I'm now doing part-time MRes at CASA at UCL, and these are my companies. I now run two companies at the moment. So my skill set's quite broad. It's somewhere between data science, data visualization, and creative coding. And I think having this broad set of skills is really important, especially in the art and cultural or creative industries, because it allows me to not bombard my audience with statistics and kind of numbers, but also to communicate those numbers visually using data visualization. And sometimes I get quite creative and I'm inspired by various generative artists to try and visualize my insights in interesting ways. So maybe you'll see some of that throughout the project as I explain some of my research. So I'm interested in this thing called cultural data science. To be honest, it's not really a thing. The term cultural data science is still undefined, but there are a few people that are using it. For example, McGill University in Canada has a Center for Social and Cultural Data Science. Aarhus University in Denmark also has a new course called Cultural Data Science. So it's this kind of emerging field where data science is being applied to not only art and culture, but to cultural studies, to anthropology, to sociology. You have people who call themselves computational social scientists. That's also a term that's been going around, but this concept of cultural data science is definitely emerging. And the way it kind of typically works is that I have a data collection pipeline. So I'm interested in various forms of data. And as you can see at the top right here, I mainly look at like social media data, urban data, which you find on open city portals like data.london, for example, but also a lot of survey data, which is either collected as primary research or secondary research. The Arts Council England, for example, has several surveys that they run every year. But survey kind of having a broad overview of all these different data sets allows me to take a holistic approach to analyzing the impact of art and culture in cities. But the way it really works is I have this kind of data collection pipeline, which is very robust throughout my academic as well as consultancy research. And the way it works is that I try and get as much data as I can through APIs mainly. I then clean and analyze data using Python mainly. But I also then visualize it using various tools. Google Cloud Platform is kind of my operation platform of choice, but I also use QGIS and D3 and a range of other things. I'm just going to quickly talk about a few projects that have really influenced my thinking about the role of art and culture in cities, and how these projects that I'm going to talk about have informed my thinking around the impact or the relationship between cultural infrastructure and Airbnb. So the first project I'd like to bring to attention is the Lumiere London 2018 project. So Lumiere was a huge contemporary art festival that happened in London in 2018. It was across 4 days, and basically the whole of London was, well, not the whole of London, I would say 6 districts of London were kind of closed down for the purposes of public art. So 50 artists and 50 different installations were installed outside of London. And I was really fascinated by this particular event because around 1 million people visited. But it was also really cool just to see this kind of art and culture as part of the built environment, as part of the city, kind of existing within the built environment. And I collected some social media data, so Twitter data and Flickr data in particular. And through this blog series that I blogged online, I looked at different elements of the data. So I did a blog post about exploratory data analysis of the tweets and the Flickr images. I also applied some natural language processing and some computer vision. And this project really kind of springboarded me into starting to look at cultural events or cultural phenomena that take place in cities. The second project that I that kind of has informed my thinking around the importance of culture in cities is Freeze Los Angeles, which happened in 2019. Very similar to the Lumiere project, except this time I looked at geotagged social media posts. And here I was able to kind of see different districts of Los Angeles that were being geotagged by basically people throughout Freeze LA. And again, I applied a similar kind of technique, but when I was thinking about this project in particular, Freeze, for those who don't know, is a huge contemporary art festival that happens, well, it started in London in the early 2000s and has now kind of evolved into a really big event. But it has a really big impact on the city, and many people come to Freeze. And there are several other cultural events that are similar, which kind of occupy a city in interesting ways. So what I wanted to kind of look at, not just these events, and I will talk about events in particular, but I was particularly interested in how people use Airbnb, whether that's people who list Airbnb, as in people who own homes or people who are renting homes. So the supply of Airbnb listings, but also the demand of Airbnb listings. How does the demand of Airbnb listings change in a city according to a cultural event, or perhaps even a piece of cultural infrastructure? So before COVID took place, obviously there was huge implications of COVID-19 and coming out of lockdown, which is going to impact people's propensity to go into Airbnbs and to visit cities. But before all of that happened, there were, a few assumptions or hypotheses that I had in regards to Airbnb supply and demand. Is it that people decide to live in a neighborhood because St. Paul's is nearby, or the Tate Modern is nearby, or the Victoria and Albert Museum is nearby, for example, in London. And so I did this data visualization project where I looked at 80,000 Airbnb listings in London, and I collected 5,000 cultural venues. And the purpose of this visualization was to really try and look at patterns, visual patterns, to see, okay, is there any visual clustering that I can see? And here, the blue kind of heat map that you see on the animation is a really high Airbnb prices. And I found that there were some patterns or particular neighborhoods where there were really high Airbnb prices, but also a lot of density of commercial galleries, music venues, theatres, public museums. And so the development of this project, I wanted to kind of look into the data a bit further. And some research questions I had following the visualization was, does the presence of cultural infrastructure, which is, cultural infrastructure is defined as any infrastructure or building that is solely used for the purpose of art and culture, whether that's to produce art or culture or to consume art or culture. Does the presence of these buildings affect the number or the frequency of Airbnb listings in a neighborhood? Or does it even affect the number of reviews or the demand of Airbnb listings in a neighborhood? And what impact does the attractiveness of the cultural infrastructure have on Airbnb listings or economic activity? And so these are kind of questions that I thought about as I went through the visualization project that I showed previously. And so I mentioned the cultural infrastructure is a term being used by the Greater London Authority. If you go onto the GLA's data.london website, or if you type cultural infrastructure map into Google, you'll come up with this map, which is on the right-hand side. And the GLA had basically commissioned several kind of small consultancies to put together a kind of repository of 10,000 cultural venues in London, broken down into 33 different categories. So you have everything from kind of artist workspaces to cinemas, private galleries, community centres, museums, music venues. The list kind of goes on. But this is a really interesting resource because it was only curated, I think, and released in March of 2019, so about a year ago. And I wanted to use this data and look at relationship between this data and Airbnb data. In terms of attractiveness, what I did was I took these, the 100 venues, so there's, sorry, 10,000 venues, and I used their rating on Google Maps as a measure for attractiveness. It's a really crude measure of attractiveness because obviously perhaps the architecture of the building or several other kind of let's say subjective variables influence an attractiveness of a building, but I use the rating as a kind of proxy for attractiveness. And from the 10,000, there were 6,000 venues that I got back from Google Maps that had a rating above 0, that weren't 0. So I took those 6,000 cultural venues and I looked at the 80,000 Airbnb data to see if there was any kind of relationship. One paper in particular that really influenced my analysis was this paper by Dudas et al. In 2017. And they looked at the socioeconomic analysis of Airbnb in New York. So they looked at various socioeconomic indicators of neighborhoods in New York. And they built a multilinear regression model looking at the effect of those socioeconomic variables on Airbnb supply and Airbnb demand. And in particular, they also had points of interest data similar to the cultural venues that I had, but they didn't do any spatial analysis. It was a very kind of global ordinary least squared model. So kind of working with the variables or similar variables that the authors used in the New York analysis, I applied a very similar methodology to London. And so I went again onto data.london and I got various socioeconomic indicators of LSOAs in London. So in London, in Greater London or Outer London, sorry, let's say Greater London, there is 4,800 LSOAs. But actually only 2,200 of them had or have cultural infrastructure inside of their LSOAs, according to the 6,000 results that I had before. So what I wanted to do was look at the percentage of, for example, Black, Asian, ethnic minorities in each LSOA, the percentage of the young population, so people of a young population, people who aren't from the UK, education levels, the number of houses that have mortgages, the prices of those houses. And I used them as control variables as I looked at the frequency of cultural infrastructure in those LSOAs. But also I looked at the rating of those cultural infrastructure in LSOAs. So if a cultural infrastructure had a rating above 4 or 4.5, it was classified as good. And what I found just using this ordinary least squared global model was that there was a kind of positive, not hugely, but positive correlation between the density of cultural infrastructure in a LSOA, or let's say a local neighborhood in London, and kind of the supply of Airbnb listings in that neighborhood. This model had an R squared of 85%, so the fit was pretty good. But it started to give me some really interesting preliminary insights into how the density of cultural infrastructure might be correlated with the supply of Airbnb listings. Now, I also wanted to look at the demand side. So I wanted to see whether the density of cultural infrastructure increases the number of reviews that happen in an LSOA for Airbnb. And Dudas et al. Basically said that the number of reviews was a good proxy for demand versus price, because you might have people who want to stay in a neighborhood, but the price might be too high. So that doesn't mean that they don't want to come and visit London and visit a neighborhood. They might go and visit Hackney, for example, that's slightly cheaper than central London. So the number of reviews is a better proxy for demand. And here, the relation, the R squared or the fit, wasn't as strong as the supply side model, but it's still significant. But here, the density of cultural infrastructure has a larger coefficient, so a larger impact on the demand of Airbnb in an LSOA than the previous model. But also, if the cultural infrastructure was rated as good, so if it was rated as above 4.5, then that's more likely to be correlated with more reviews in an LSOA. So these global models were interesting because they kind of gave some preliminary insights into the effect of, or how cultural infrastructure might impact or the demand and supply of Airbnb listings. But with when you have spatial variables, obviously there will be differences across London. So the cultural infrastructure, for example, in Camden might be very different to the cultural infrastructure in South Kensington. In Camden, you might have more music venues, whereas in South Kensington, you might have more museums. Now, the effect of cultural infrastructure, therefore, is not, you can't apply a global model to the whole of London, because there are spatial differences in not only the cultural infrastructure, but the demand and supply of, and the attractiveness of an area. So what I extended the model to include a geographically weighted regression model. And this was to basically break down the global model into loads of local models where each LSOA had its own equation. And therefore, the coefficients of each of those equations, and therefore for each LSOA, is known to be variable across space. And here I find really interesting spatial patterns where the effect of cultural infrastructure is much more pronounced in very particular neighborhoods, and it can't be universally applied the same to South London as to North London. So if you can see on the map, it might be slightly small, but on these kind of darker patches here, on both the supply side and demand side, the density of cultural infrastructure in both Camden and Shoreditch has a much more pronounced increase on both the supply and the demand of Airbnb listings than in Greenwich, for example, or in or Islington, or in other parts of London. Similarly, the rating of cultural infrastructure in Hackney is much more pronounced on the supply and demand of Airbnb listings than in Greenwich, for example. So the geographic weighted regression model allowed me to extrapolate or really kind of look at the global model much more locally and spatially, and try and understand how the model differs according to geography. So that's kind of a summary of the project. Again, it's a really high summary, and I know I've only got half an hour, and I'd be happy to take questions afterwards. But if you want to see this report or the research in more detail, you can go to the online repo, which is at my website, vishalkumar.london/data science/cultural infrastructure Airbnb analysis/book. And it's basically an R book, which was made in RStudio. But all the code for this project is at that book and can be forked or used for reproducibility. But yeah, this is a kind of work in progress, and there's kind of many other angles that I want to explore in relation to culture and Airbnb. One in particular is, so that was kind of cultural infrastructure. What about big cultural events? So events like Fashion Week, or big events like Edinburgh Fringe, or kind of other events. Not only is cultural infrastructure is important, but how do events impact the supply and demand for Airbnb, and can they be accounted for as we're doing the analysis? And I've just started to plant the seeds of a project in relation to London Fashion Week, where I'm reproducing I'm starting out by doing, this is typically how I go about projects. I typically try and do a visualization project to begin with, to really map out some visual patterns and some kind of visual clues. And this is an interactive website, which you can find on my website as well. But essentially, here I look at how the number of Airbnb reviews increased during London Fashion Week. Instead of using LSOAs, I used the Uber H3 spatial index to get a more granular look at a neighborhood Airbnb activity. But there are some early patterns that London Fashion Week significantly increased the number of reviews, so the demand of Airbnb during that week, which is kind of expected. But I want to take the research about geographically weighted regression models and now apply it to cultural events going forward. And I think, just to kind of wrap up, like, why am I doing all of this research? For me, it's about producing kind of, it's not all about producing academic papers, and for me, it's a lot about kind of working with cities and governments down to the policy level. So really working on real world projects. And there's a clear kind of mandate, or at least there was in 2019, or before that actually, where cities are looking at culture in interesting ways to kind of help with economic and social value of bringing people together. Like famously, London released a huge culture strategy in December 2018. The World Cities Culture Report has been going for some time now, and that's commissioned by BOP Consultancy with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Mayor of London. And the narrative is to really look at kind of culture in cities and the impact that it has. And what I want to try and do is use some of this research to either guide or influence policy, especially how investments of public and private money are spent in relation to either cultural infrastructure or cultural events. And I'm working on I'm currently working on several projects, and I have also worked on a couple of projects with regards to cultural policy and management. So I was the lead data scientist for the London Borough of Culture 2019 program. Unfortunately, I think the 2021 has been affected quite a bit by COVID-19, but a lot of activity is still taking place online. I'm also on the technical reference group for Coventry 2021, which is the next UK City of Culture. And I'm part of the City of Culture Research Network. I'm also working on a project in the USA with BOP Consultancy, which is the Bloomberg Public Art Challenge. And I will be presenting some of my research at the European Commission Joint Research Centre. But for me, it's really trying to translate some of the work that I'm doing in a very practical way to kind of influence policy and management decisions. And a development that I'm looking at is in relation to natural language processing. So I mentioned at the beginning some of the data that I work with. Social media data is really interesting in the domain of art and culture. I mean, even though a lot of social media data is prone to significant bias, I still think that it can be analyzed in interesting ways to try and draw sentiment for certain events. So here for the London Borough of Culture programme, I analysed around 3,000 tweets of a particular event to look at the kind of sentiment score over time. And I'd love to see maybe the geographic distribution of sentiment. But also I applied kind of a semantic analysis to the tweets by applying the word to vec algorithm. And here I was looking at words that kind of appeared in relation to a target word. So the target word here was welcome to the forest, which was the official hashtag of the opening event of London Borough of Culture. And you have words like involved, proud, enjoy, fantastic, fun, children, families being described or being used when people are describing how they are reacting or tweeting about the opening event. So there's many kind of different angles, and social media data is, especially Twitter data, is very text heavy. I am also looking at survey data, which was kind of given to me on this project as well. It's not just social media data. I think we can augment it with survey data as well to try and get a better understanding of social value of culture. And I've spoken about it a couple of times, but it's worth kind of clarifying that obviously COVID-19 has had the effects on art and culture are still kind of unknown, but they're likely to be quite significant, especially on tourism and travel. So, I mean, some of the quite obvious implications are, is there going to be a reluctance of shared accommodation following, excuse me, COVID-19? Is there going to be less footfall? This chart by The Economist, which was released a couple of weeks ago, I forget which paper they were citing, but it just shows the change in mobility compared to, well, February, March, April, and May of this year. Mobility and footfall data is significantly down. How does that affect how people move around a city or their likelihood to attend cultural events and stuff like this? These are kind of things that I would like to explore and look at pre and post COVID as my research develops over time. So that, I think, is just 1 minute below 30. So thanks a lot for listening. That was, I went through that quite quickly. If you do have questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. But yeah.
Thank you, Vishal. Great presentation. So we have two questions on the urbanbs.org/CUSP. So first question. So why not using a combination of ratings and number of ratings? So I suppose combination of the rating value and the number of ratings as a proxy for attractiveness. So you might have, I guess the question is, you might have one rating and it's 5-star. Might be that 5-star.
Yeah. Actually, I should have mentioned that I did collect the number of total ratings as well, and I dropped those that were below, like maybe 2 standard deviations away from the kind of mean number of ratings. So ones that were, if they were just like 1 or 2 or 3, then they were kind of disregarded. But yeah, it is an important point, and I think also to add to that, Google Places was the only one that I used for ratings. I would like to also look at several other websites like Foursquare or a range of others and kind of make an index of the ratings.
Yeah, sounds good. And the second question, which is a bit more difficult, is do you have monetary impact of culture. So they're asking for what's the
monitoring
impact. So can you quantify impact in terms of pounds?
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum, I think. I think the lack of data is obviously the biggest barrier to try and doing something like this. I've looked. I mean, typically there's a lot of literature kind of in before 2010 that tried to look at the impact of culture on house prices. I don't think house prices are good enough indicator for that, because they're quite house price data is typically very slow moving and very infrequent. So I kind of debated or dabbled with the idea of using Airbnb prices as a proxy because the transaction time is much quicker. But then I don't think that Airbnb prices capture impact entirely either. So there's also this kind of thing that we need to deal with regards to non-use and use values. So the Nesta, in particular Hassan Bakshi, and the DCMS, the Department for Media and Culture Studies, they have the Green Book, and in the Green Book they refer to the value of culture as being both non-use and use. And the way in which you try and gain value from use and non-use is both different, and they require different methodologies. So with regards to non-use, there are some techniques called stated preference techniques, which rely on mainly surveys and contingent valuation surveys, which ask kind of hypothetical questions like, if you removed this park or if you removed this museum, how much would you be willing to pay on top of your taxes to keep it? And so you can start to kind of get monetary figures on this. But to answer the question about cultural impact, it's still something that I'm working on and something that I'm thinking about. But again, I think things will change quite a bit post-COVID, because looking at data pre-COVID and looking at data post-COVID and running the same tests, I think will be a really interesting exercise. So yeah.
So I guess it's a hard problem. So the answer is no. But arguably, following your thoughts, so arguably you can measure the premium price, because for the same listing, right? So because for the same listing, you randomize everything, so you control everything else except the presence or absence of an event. So you could do that in theory, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I think that there are more questions on the app. I will open I guess there is a floor. There are a bunch of people, so I would ask if anyone has got a question, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Eugene is still recording, by the way. So.